what I want to name about this slide is that these specific categories of parents did not come from me. So I did not create this list myself. This comes from Jonice Webb, who is the author of Running on Empty, which is a book that specifically talks about childhood emotional neglect. So it's in your resource list, but she is one of the prominent thought leaders on the topic of childhood emotional neglect. So these different categories of these different types of parents come from her. So I'm going to be sharing about her work and her theory about this topic. So again, this is not an exhaustive list in my perspective, in my opinion, but this list, which I'll go through each of them, talks a lot about the different characteristics or the different qualities of parents or of caregivers that can lead to emotional neglect, that can lead to those emotional needs that we just named not being met for a child. And you'll see as we go through this list that there is a vast variety of characteristics that lead to that. So it's not only one type of parent or one type of caregiver that lead to a child experiencing emotional neglect. They said the 30%, doesn't the inconsistency present a problem? And what's really important to know about that, kind of back to the rupture and repair part, is that the 30% accounts for the parent attuning, right? The parent reattuning, the parent making repair. If it was only 30% and the parent never tried to make a repair attempt or never acknowledged the impact of what they did on the child, then that would probably have more negative results, right? But the 30% talks about that a parent is not going to be perfect and that they don't have to be perfect, right? I wonder if some of what this question asker is naming or is getting at is the idea of what can contribute to anxious attachment. And we know that inconsistency and parental attunement can lead to anxious attachment. So that is a very apt thought. But this 30% comes from research, which teaches us that as long as a parent makes repair attempts and acknowledges their mistakes, then getting it right only needs to happen 30% of the time in order for the child to develop a secure attachment. So that's a fantastic question. But again, it's really hopeful. It tells us that the parent doesn't need to be perfect, because we could probably think throughout our own life, right? Both in ourselves as individuals, as when we were children, or ourselves in relationships with friends or partners, or even ourselves as therapists or mental health professionals. I can recognize both on the end of the person being in a caregiver role and a care receiver role that I don't always get it right. When my friend is sharing something with me that bothers them, I might not always completely accurately attune to what they're feeling. I might not completely accurately always understand what they're trying to say or what they need from me. And same thing on the other end. When I'm receiving care, the person who's listening to me might not get it perfectly accurate, both in our personal relationships as well as our professional relationships. But what we know is that perfection and attunement isn't what we need in order to still be able to feel connected to people. So that is part of why I think it's so hopeful and an important message when we're working with parents or caregivers, to let them know that perfection is not the goal. And this message is not to enforce this idea or to communicate this idea that you don't have to care about attunement, that you don't have to care about how your child feels, right? But the idea of attunement only needing to happen accurately 30% of the time is often a message that I give to parents who feel a lot of perfectionism within themselves about their parenting, and recognizing that the research says that it only requires 30% is often soothing. And most parents don't take that as permission to just intentionally misattune to their child, but more so as something that is soothing within themselves to recognize that my child doesn't need me to be a perfect parent. And if I'm not a perfect parent, that doesn't mean that my child is going to have a terrible life. And often when I tell parents that increases their regulation, that increases their self-compassion, which in turn increases their ability to actually attune to their child more effectively and more accurately. So the more that I can work to, and we're kind of skipping ahead a little bit here, but as a teaser a little bit, the more that I can help parents soothe themselves, and the more that I can have parents undo any sense of shame or self-criticism within themselves, that is actually something that increases their capacity to effectively be with their child in the way that we know is going to be the most supportive. So we'll talk more about that as we continue. So now let's talk about qualities of parents and caregivers that can contribute to emotional neglect. The first one on this list is the narcissistic parent. So narcissism is a popular word in today's culture, and people talk about it in a lot of different ways. But what I'm talking about narcissistic parents here, what I'm talking about is parents who are very self-focused, who their needs are what matter. And oftentimes for narcissistic parents, their child is kind of an extension of them. If their child gets an A on the test, it doesn't matter that their child gets to feel a sense of accomplishment. It only matters that their child got an A on the test because then they feel like a really smart parent, right? Another example of narcissism might be a parent who only acknowledges that their child likes something if it's actually something that they themselves like. It might also look like a parent only caring about their child if it benefits them in some way. So I'm not going to drive you to soccer practice because you like soccer practice. I'm going to drive you to soccer practice because I want to be seen as the best soccer parent to all the other parents, right? So again, narcissistic parents are really focused on their own wants, their own needs, their own feelings. And in turn, that can that can lead the child to feel like who they are, what they want, what they feel doesn't actually matter. And a really common way that children of narcissistic parents learn to adapt to that kind of caregiving is to disconnect from their own needs, to disconnect from their own wants, which, as we talk about further down in the presentation, often leads to certain types of clinical presentations in our therapy offices, such as difficulty acknowledging what they feel. And that's not because of something inherent inside of them, right? That they were born with a difficulty acknowledging that. It's because as a way to adapt to narcissistic parenting, they've had to focus on what the parent needs and wants to keep themselves safe. So again, narcissism is often what we think of parents who are very focused on themselves. And this can be parents who are really aggressive and harsh in their focus on themselves. Or this can also be parents who are more kind of subtle or subdued and might not necessarily be loud or aggressively angry, but who more on a subtle level or an insidious level are still focused on themselves rather than on their child. So an example of this might be if a child says to their parent, "Hey, I'm really upset about this. I really wanted to go play outside." A more subtle example of a narcissistic parent might be one who says something like, "Oh, but it doesn't but I really wanted to be able to go to the store and now I can't go to the store," right? So they make the child's feelings actually all about them. They turn the focus from what the child is communicating to how it impacts them. That's just one example. Okay. The bereaved parent, when we're talking about bereavement, we're talking about grief, right? So this might be a parent who just lost a loved one, maybe a parent who lost a spouse, who lost a friend, who lost a child. So this might be a parent who has no malintention to harm their child, is not intentionally at all wanting to hurt their child or neglect their child. But this might be a parent who is so in the middle and in the messiness of their own grief process that they don't have a lot of emotional energy or capacity to attune to their child. And the thing that I want to say here, and the thing that I want to emphasize multiple times throughout this presentation, because I feel so important, is that emotional neglect is often not intentional. Emotional neglect is often not malicious. And that is why it can be so insidious. And that is partially why it can be so hard for the clients or the folks that we work with in our offices to self-identify as having been emotionally neglected. Oftentimes, people can experience emotional neglect even from parents who deeply love them, even from parents who deeply care about them. Emotional neglect is not something that most parents, right, maybe except for like we talked, like is in this list, the narcissistic parent or the sociopathic parent, perhaps. Emotional neglect is not something that parents are intentionally doing to their child. It is often something that can happen as a result of other parental stressors or preoccupations.